I was thinking when you were talking about Lincoln, who believed in human transformation, I was thinking of my favorite phrase in the second inaugural: if every drop of blood drawn by the lash must now be repaid by another drawn from the sword, still it will be said that the ways of God are righteous altogether.
Yes.
That is a profound judgment. But the Declaration of Independence, which Lincoln knew extremely well a long time before that, begins with this reference to the laws of nature and of nature's God.
Mm-hmm.
And in those who signed that document and Thomas Jefferson who wrote it, they imagine a universe in which God is sitting in judgment equally upon them and upon the king. In other words, there's something beyond us.
Mm-hmm.
We can grow, we can settle a continent, we can become more prosperous, we can enjoy a wider equality of activity. We have an equality of rights in that document. But in the end, the final judgment will be something eternal in light of which we have to live. Are you saying that Lincoln learned that because of the Civil War and didn't know it before?
He had glimmerings. He had to have had glimmerings because the very Calvinistic faith in which his parents reared him would have told him that whatever happens in this world happens as a result of God's providence and God's direction. So he has, through even the earliest stages of his life, a very, very clear and palpable sense of the directing power of God in human affairs. The question is, how directing, how powerful, how intrusive? How do you understand God? In a very real sense, his ancestral Calvinism hobbled him somewhat, because if you understand that God decrees all events, whatever comes to pass, then your decision to embrace God also is part of God's decree, and you can't get ahead of that. You've got to wait for God to move you toward God. And in a sense, that slowed down Lincoln's reactions. It slowed down Lincoln's way of thinking. But the war accelerates that. The war does not give him a chance to simply look at the war and say, well, this is simply a matter of force. This is simply a matter of power. This is simply a matter of the application of politics. No, for him, the Civil War has this enormous moral dimension. It's moving towards a moral goal. What could that goal possibly be? He writes a very interesting memorandum in possibly, we think, 1862, because there's no date on it. But it sounds like 1862. And in it, he tries to work out, what is the purpose of God in this war? It almost reads like a problem in geometry as he walks through it. And what he is trying to do is to establish, what is the purpose of God here? All right, if the purpose of God was for the North to win the war, he could have done that in the first few months of the war. If the purpose of God was for the Confederacy to win the war, well, he could have done that very easily, too, in the first few months. Why is the war going on the way it is? And the conclusion he eventually comes to is, God has a purpose in this war, different from what either North or South began the war with. We have to see what that purpose is. Now, I think very plainly, what he's working towards is emancipation, the end of slavery. Yet at the same time, watch how he's doing this. He's not talking about God, as he had talked about God 10 years before, as a very remote God, a deity somewhere in the universe. No, he's talking about a God who is actually involved in the process of human affairs. And that particular sense, that particular notion, that concept of God is what the war helps to trigger in him, because he has no other explanation for the costs of the war than to say God has a personal involvement in what is happening in human affairs.
Was it in 1863 that, I think it was, that Lincoln had some free Negro leaders in the White House and talked to him about colonization?
August of 1862.
And they didn't like it.
No.
What did Lincoln conclude from that?
This is one of those unusual moments when you're not sure if you're listening to Lincoln, the 19th century white supremacist, or whether you are listening to the Lincoln who is one unusually shrewd politician. Colonization was supposed to be one of those solutions to the problem of slavery that white supremacists in America were supposed to love. Because what it would say would be, all right, we will move towards emancipation, but once we move towards emancipating the slaves, we will take all those slaves and we will deport them somewhere. Because we want it to be understood that the United States is for white people. So we'll solve the slave problem, yes, by emancipating, but then we will take those whom we've emancipated, and basically we will punish them. We will punish them for having been born in America. Because we're going to deny that their being born in America means anything, and we're going to ship them somewhere else. People looked at colonization, and they could draw one of two conclusions to it. If you were someone who was really committed to the abolition of slavery, and especially if you were a black American, you would look at colonization and say, thanks for nothing. Some of us have family that have gone back generations long before the white people who are constructing schemes of colonization before they were ever here. Why should we leave? Why don't you go back to Ireland or Germany or Scandinavia or wherever? Because we've been here for longer than you have. And the reaction would be, this is ridiculous. This could only come from just someone who's peddling more white supremacist ideas. All right, that's one way. One way. Now, here's the other way. How do you get a culture which is top-heavy with notions about white supremacy to agree to emancipation in the first place? Here is where the politician, as Lincoln, comes to play. How is he going to get Northern whites to sign on to the idea of emancipation? Remember, we go into this Civil War and people are swearing up and down, we are fighting the Confederacy for the purpose of restoring the Union. Not really involving ourselves in this question of slavery and race because we don't want to think about black people. We don't want black people coming away from the South up into the North and competing for Northern jobs. All right, how do you persuade Northerners who have that view to endorse emancipation? You do it by saying, all right, let's sugarcoat emancipation. We'll talk about colonization. If we talk about colonization, will you agree to emancipation? And the testimony of a lot of Northerners was, well, all right, okay. So what does Lincoln do? He invites a delegation of black leaders to the White House. He also invites the press. What are they doing there? They're there to write this up in the newspapers. Lincoln is sending a message. We will talk about emancipation, but we'll sugarcoat it. And that's the message, I think at least, that Lincoln is trying to communicate.
I remember, I think, the notes from that, or the newspaper accounts of that, and he puts it in, he says, everywhere you go in the Union, the ban is still upon you.
Yeah.
And wonder if you want to go. There's a place. You'd have to want to go, he says.
Oh, yes.
There's a place.
He's not doing compulsory. This is not going to be deportation. It's going to be a volunteer basis.
Yeah. And I don't know why you would want to live around us, he says. And then he says, think about it, right? And they come back and say, no, don't want to go.
Right. That statement of Lincoln's may be the most revealing one of all, when he says, you don't have a whole lot of motivation to live around us. He said, our race has not given you many reasons to love us. Yeah. And as soon as he said that, I mean, you can hear a lot of people clutching their chests and falling over. Yeah. But he's doing. Why is he pursuing this colonization thing? I think in large measure, it's because he wants to put a billboard up. We want to go to emancipation, and if this will still the opposition, all right, then we'll talk about colonization. Now, understand something. This is August of 1862. He has the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation sitting at his desk. He's already read it to his cabinet. He knows where he wants to go with this. What he is doing, he's doing some public relations here. At least, this is the interpretation as I'm reading it, but it's also the interpretation that a number of other people saw in it. One foreign observer, Frederick Milnes Edge, and a very famous black pastor, Henry McNeil Turner, in Washington, D.C., saying, look, understand what Lincoln is getting at. Lincoln is trying to damp down the opposition to emancipation.